Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining our TREAD Talk this evening. I am Jessica Karlsruher, the Executive Director of TREAD Coalition, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am a sixth-generation Texan, and I began my career with the Texas Association of Realtors. So having joined TREAD a little over a year ago, I feel like it's coming full circle in my career to be able to serve the citizens of Texas by helping protect private property rights. For those of you who aren't familiar with TREAD, the acronym stands for the Texas Real Estate Advocacy and Defense Coalition. We are a statewide, nonpartisan, member-based organization that educates, advocates for, and defends private property rights at the state and local levels. Below you will see buttons. I put our contact information in the chat box, and you can also submit questions to the panelists in the Q&A section that you'll find on the right. We will be addressing all of those questions, or as many as we can, time permitting, at the end of the panel discussion. So TREAD Talks is our newest educational programming connecting landowners, experts, legislators, and the general public on issues affecting rural landowners across the state. Our programming covers issues like water, conservation, ranching, various industries in the state of Texas, and eminent domain, which brings us to tonight's discussion on eminent domain reforms in the state. So with us this evening are three seasoned panelists on this issue. I'll first start with Kaleb McLaurin, who is a sixth-generation Texan from Piney Woods and attended Texas A&M University in College Station. Upon graduation, he accepted a position with the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, where he now serves as their Executive Director of Government and Public Affairs. In this role, Kaleb oversees TSCRA's activities involving Congress, the Texas Legislature, state and federal regulatory agencies, press, social media outlets, and their political action committee. Next on the panel, we have Marissa Patton. Marissa joins the Texas Farm Bureau in 2013. She is their Associate Legislative Director. And there she monitors issues and legislation pertaining to eminent domain, agricultural commodities, wildlife, rural affairs, land use authority, and appropriations. Patton was raised in Stamford, Texas, where her family maintains a small farming and ranching operation. She's also a graduate of Stamford High School and earned her bachelor's at Texas Tech University. Prior to joining the Texas Farm Bureau, Marissa worked in Washington, D.C. with Senator John Cornyn. She has also worked in Austin for the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. Last but not least on our panel tonight is David Yates. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Texas Wildlife Association. It's a 35-year-old organization with approximately 10,000 members. TWA focuses on natural resource education, hunter recruitment and retention, while maintaining a robust advocacy presence at the Texas Capitol. Yeates graduated with an agricultural economics degree from Texas A&M University and completed the Southwestern Graduate School of Banking at SMU. He has worked in community banking for more than 14 years, most recently serving as president of the New Braunfels and Seguin Banking Centers for Prosperity Bank prior to joining TWA in 2014. His family still owns their fifth-generation homestead and continues to farm and ranch in the rolling plains of Texas. He's also an avid hunter, angler, and spends much of his recreational time out in the field or the coast. And he has volunteered for a number of nonprofits, including Habitat for Humanity, Ducks Unlimited, and the Coastal Conservation Association. So thank you all for being here tonight and participating in our panel.
Thank you for having us.
So since TREAD Talks is meant to be educational and informative, I'd like to start the evening off by each of you telling the audience a little bit more about your organization and the landowner issues you focus on. And Kaleb, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, TSCRA, Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, is actually 143 years old. We were founded in 1877. Right now, we currently have about 17,500 memberships, but you have to remember those memberships are sold on a per head basis. Granted, we have a lot of folks that have 0 to 50 head, aka may not necessarily own livestock. They're just interested in other parts of the organization and other things that we work on. But we think that represents about 55,000 individuals raising 4 million head of cattle on 76 million acres of land. And when you look at when we were originally founded, we didn't have a good, robust law enforcement system in the state of Texas, and so cattle rustling was a big issue back then. And so that was actually the impetus that got us going. A bunch of landowners had people stealing livestock, and they said, "Listen, we're problem solvers. We need to figure out how to, come up with a solution to this." And so they created an organization, used the membership dues that they paid into the organization to hire at that time detectives to go out and find the cattle rustlers and bring those guys to justice. And so today, 143 years later, that's still a very core part of our mission. And we actually have TSCRA special rangers set up in the statute similar to Sheriff's Department or the Texas Rangers. And they're scattered all throughout Texas and Oklahoma and still serve that purpose, working for the public, but solely funded by TSCRA membership dues. And so that was the reason we were created. However, it didn't take long to realize that there were other issues that needed to be addressed. And even just on that law enforcement component, there were things that needed to be put in place, for instance, in the Texas legislature, in order for those guys to adequately do their job and bring some of those criminals to justice. And so, fast forward some years, that's when you ended up with the government relations arm of Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. And so when you ask what issues that we as an organization focus on, I always like to say that it's everything that affects a person's ability to raise livestock in the state of Texas. And so when you start looking at that list, you've certainly got animal health concerns, the marketing of beef, livestock marketing in general, the marketing of the live animals, but it quickly trickles down to water, property rights, and quite frankly, over the past couple legislative sessions, that's probably what we spent the majority of our time on, is those two issues, just because they do have such a profound impact on a person's ability to use the land that they own to raise livestock.
Great. Marissa, I'll go to you.
Sure. Texas Farm Bureau is a long-standing trade association that has been put together through grassroots members. We have over 500,000 member families who have joined Texas Farm Bureau. Largely, we structure our organization around providing support and education, certainly for our farming and ranching families. Largely, we really focus on our smaller farming and ranching families, which make up the bulk of our membership, as well as the bulk of Texas agriculture. We provide educational support for especially some of the younger farming and ranching programs that we organize and prop up. We provide scholarships for the youth scholarships for graduates from high school going into college, and those who are exceeding and going on to graduate programs beyond college as well. Not to mention all of what we do as a part of the legislative team, advocating for all of our policy issues that our grassroots members have supported and passed into our policy book, and taking that then through to the state and federal legislative and regulatory arenas. So certainly we're focused on a lot of the issues that Kaleb just mentioned as well, and it's always good to have a partner on some of those issues with the Cattle Raisers Association. But also we tend to focus on many commodity issues that affect farming as well. That really pools a broad list of issues kind of under our purview, but it has been the case too that we certainly focus on a lot of property right issues that affect our ability to farm and ranch, or our members' ability to farm and ranch. One addition to kind of point out beyond just the eminent domain issue that we're focused on for this webinar is land use issues, and still how some ongoing annexation problems are occurring throughout the state of Texas. We've been spending some time working on that lately as well.
Great, thanks. And David?
Well, we're the new kids on the block here at 35 years old and only 10,000 members in comparison to our friends at Cattle Raisers and Farm Bureau. But in '85, a group of wildlife managers recognized that the Texas legislature was contemplating some some regs that were problematic for wildlife managers and some land use practices. So they rallied the troops, and that was really the impetus or precipitant for the beginning of TWA. And as Kaleb alluded, as the organization matured, we recognized the need for more and more things. So we run a youth education program that reaches over 600,000 young Texans every year across the state, with educators that are in classrooms all over. We obviously are leveraging a lot more technology these days to deliver that curriculum. We run the largest youth hunting program in the country in partnership with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, where we take about 1,400 kids a year on their first hunt with mom or dad or grandma or granddad. We run a few other hunting recruitment and retention programs, but the proverbial alligator in the boat is public policy. Here in Texas, it's a private land state. We all know those statistics. The vast preponderance of wildlife habitat is on private ground in our state, and that's why property rights matter. Not only are they foundational to our republic, but when we're talking about a landowner's ability to steward natural resources, including wildlife, those property rights become just absolutely critical. That's the part of the Venn diagram that overlaps with our friends represented here from Farm Bureau and cattle raisers, and a few other things like water, and certainly some wildlife issues tend to bleed into all organizations. But we view ourselves really as the kind of the leading voice on wildlife management in the state. There's not a lot of focused advocacy on that front in the legislature. So that's where we put our finger in the dam, and it's a privilege to serve that role for the state.
Thank you. Well, so now when we think of eminent domain, we know that cities and counties exercise the power of eminent domain for the greater good and public use. And we also know that there are some industries who exercise the power of eminent domain as well. So I wanted to kind of know your experience, in terms of efforts that have been made in past sessions for reforms for landowners, and what have been the biggest impediments in those reforms.
I think it's David's turn to go first.
I knew that was coming. It's a complicated question. I think it's fair to say that our three organizations have been at the table for many sessions in a row now, and what began with discussion about public eminent domain use, cities, counties, the state, TxDOT, those types of outfits, as well as the privates like pipelines, midstream, et cetera. As we moved through this process and found the pinch points for the legislature, and recognized some other processes that are in place, like TxDOT as a good example. There's a pretty robust structure that goes along with that. Are they perfect? No, but is that where we can move the ball the furthest? Probably not. So as this discussion has evolved and continued over many years, and far before my time joining this organization almost 7 years ago, we've continued to distill the conversation down to get at the real core of what we're trying to accomplish, and that's just introduce some equity into the process for landowners. It's easy to finger wag and make accusations on where the hurdles are, or who the scoundrel is, or whose fault it is. But the fact of the matter is, Texas has We're a burgeoning state. We're going through a lot of growth. We have economic drivers that affect land use, i.e. energy specifically, and the transportation of that energy, be it pipelines or power lines or whatever. But we also have a state and a legislature that values our state identity, that values property rights, and finding the Goldilocks solution there in our legislature that balances property rights and business continuity has been it's been elusive. But I believe the legislature and I'd like to think that industry as well are committed to finding a workable solution that satisfies everybody's concerns. How's that for a dodge, Kaleb?
I thought you did a really great job. I'll even expand on that a little bit. As I mentioned, TSCRA is quite old, predates me by about 113 years. And this is certainly not new challenges that property owners have faced in the state of Texas. We've been growing for quite a long time. I don't know that we've ever been growing at quite this rate. I know Governor Abbott was frequently heard saying that we're growing at a rate of 1,000 people a day. I heard a state senator say the other day that that's increased a little bit till they think about 1,100. Regardless, we are growing. And just as David said, there's a lot of challenges there. And there's, with that, we've all got to kind of come together and find a solution to it. And I agree with you, David, that, I think everybody is well-intended and wants to find something that works best, both for property owners in the state of Texas, but also for industry and business. And so we rely upon each other in so many different ways. And so it's just absolutely critical that we come together and find a solution to this. And as you mentioned, when you talk about history and what we've done the past couple of sessions and how that's helped us hone our focus a little bit. I'll pick on TxDOT since their name's already been brought up here, but similar to a lot of other condemning entities, it's an arm of the government. It's a branch of the government in essence. And so there are a lot of procedures. As frustrating as a private citizen that works on regulatory issues as a bureaucratic system may be, and as slow as that may seem to move sometimes, like all of those protections are certainly put there, well-intended and for a purpose. And so you have those type things in place, because what are they doing? They're trying to provide roadways for the citizens of Texas, Texans that serve all Texans. And so because of that, there also have some mechanisms put in place to protect the property rights of some of those individuals. Is it perfect? As David said, absolutely not. Are there challenges? Sure. But when, the calls that we get to our office, they're not typically calling to talk about TxDOT. It seems that a lot of the issues that arise just happen to kind of circle around some of the private industry that are for-profit companies that are doing some of this work. And obviously, we understand why, right? They're for-profit businesses. They have to turn around and make a profit, and we understand that. And so they're surely trying to do everything they can to be as profitable as possible, and which is perfectly fine. I understand that's the type of society that we live in. However, whenever you come in with that great power that's been granted to you by the state of Texas, we just want to make sure that folks that may not have gone through this process before aren't railroaded, and later look back once the deal is done and have a lot of regrets, because there's issues with the land use and stuff after the condemnor has already put the project in and left. And a lot of those things it's too late to fix. And that's something that family or subsequent owners have to deal with from here into perpetuity at this point. And so that's kind of been our what's created that honing focus for us. And while we really okay, look, we're all growing. There's struggles with that, but let's focus on some of the areas that we have the biggest concern and the biggest grievances, and let's get that taken care of so we can continue to grow and prosper here in Texas.
Well, so let's discuss that a little further, because, Texas has a landowner bill of rights, and it sounds like some of these things would fit nicely into that. So where has the legislature gone in terms of evaluating that landowner bill of rights, and what room for improvement is there in terms of, negotiations on the table to add in some of those protections for landowners?
I'll take that one. Certainly the Landowner Bill of Rights is very important for landowners to receive and understand. Knowing how this process works, knowing what their rights are within the process, and basically having an understanding of how to navigate the process and what to do if they run into some hurdles that many landowners end up facing due to giving this power over to sometimes private entities, private companies that still are able to somewhat profit off of this ability to take private property, as long as it, however, is supposedly for public use. Most of the time, it is hard for landowners to understand, even by having been very familiar with the document produced right now by the Attorney General's office. But beyond that, and it's really important to also focus on, certainly landowner education is a big component in all of this, and many have to be prepared kind of almost even beforehand, so they're not really behind the starting line too far right out of the gate. But also ends up being a frustrating conversation, because you really get to the point where landowners may have a good understanding of their rights, but that understanding then turns into a frustration about how limited those rights are due to the mishaps and what the current process allows. There's still so many holes that need to be filled, and so many measures that need to be taken up and considered to really examine, are we doing this for the best interest of Texas, and are we providing a process that basically kicks out and disables the bad actors, any of those entities or companies trying to take advantage of landowners, but also really requires and secures those property right protections that landowners need and deserve to believe and to understand that the process is in place, and that the authority exists for the better interest of the full state of Texas.
Well, so TRED got involved with eminent domain the last legislative session, and obviously worked on pipeline routing reform. And that was the genesis of that was in 2018. You know, landowners in the Hill Country received letters of condemnation announcing the construction of a Permian Highway pipeline being built by Kinder Morgan through the Hill Country that would be carrying natural gas from the Permian Basin to the Katy area. And so the concerns of these landowners arose because pipelines historically don't come through the Hill Country, particularly because you have aquifers, recharge zones, sensitive karst features in the area that are all kind of tied to drinking water for millions of Central Texans. So I know that there were bills filed by elected officials in both chambers addressing the issue, including some pipeline routing process that would either, one, be regulated by the Railroad Commission or be regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And so what role did your organizations play last session in terms of these discussions and some of the bills that were filed?
I'll start, I guess, unless somebody else wants to jump on that one. You know, we worked with Cattle Raisers and Farm Bureau collectively, beginning in the interim, with meetings with industry, primarily represented by a coalition that refers to themselves as the Coalition for Critical Infrastructure, to talk about the process rather than focusing on specific projects like the Kinder Morgan pipeline coming through such a ecologically important and unique and sensitive place like the Texas Hill Country. As a statewide organization, TWA felt compelled to work on the process for all landowners. And so that manifested itself in the bill that Senator Lois Colcourse filed in the Senate, 541, I believe. 421, there you go. And that bill with cattle raisers and Farm Bureau, we worked with Senator Kolkhorst and thankfully and really appreciated his leadership. Lieutenant Governor Patrick moderated and participated extensively personally in negotiation sessions with the Coalition for Critical Infrastructure, and ultimately we passed, or the Senate passed a bill that came out of that negotiation process. And then it went over to the House. Representative Dwayne Burns picked it up, and the negotiations continued, and we got all the way to the right to the very end. The bill did get referred to a conference committee. There was a motion to instruct that conference committee by Dr. Mary Gonzalez from Clint, Texas. That motion passed. So in my mind, and I know I'm not alone, that bill passed the legislature. We just got hung up on a technicality and ran out of time like the Aggie football team. But we were in the trenches every day with our friends at Cattle Raisers and Farm Bureau, and there were many other organizations like TRED that were helping put wind in those sails. But that's the role we played, and the reason we focused on that bill rather than something that's a little more project specific, just trying to represent our statewide membership.
Well, so Representative Aaron Zwiener, who represents Blanco and Hayes County, where much of the Permian Highway pipeline has been constructed, just announced the refiling of her bill that would require the Public Utility Commission to issue permits for pipeline routing. Since that was not necessarily Senator Kolkhorst's direction, how do you feel about that as an option for your organizations, but also, you know, are there going to be previous bills or variations of the bills like Senate Bill 421 to be filed again?
Well, I might take that one since Representative Zwiener is my state representative. I've lived in Hayes County since 2015, I guess, and know her and work with her on a number of different issues. You know, I certainly see why that. You know, I'm sitting in Dripping Springs now. I previously lived in Kyle, and that Kinder Morgan line went right across the street from where my house was. And so I know, because I live right there in some of those neighborhoods, I know how important that is to her constituents. And I think that's the critical piece in this discussion is there's a lot of infrastructure being built across the state of Texas right now and has been for the last number of years. And with that, you have a lot of people that are upset with the process, and they see different issues that they've identified as being, hey, this is the main thing that we think is wrong. And of course, everybody has their own solutions to fix that. And so I certainly, I understand exactly where Representative Zwiener is coming from. And I'm sure, as you always do with any, you know, issue that's it's a real hot topic at any given time, you see a lot of bills that come with a lot of different approaches to an issue or two. There's a lot of bills that we work on. You know, I think typically cattle raisers tracks anywhere from 10 to 12% of all bills filed during a typical legislative session. And you look at those and like, why is it so many? Well, it's, you know, there's 20 bills on this one issue. 15 of them are alike, and 5 of them are 5 different concepts that other people have brought. And so I think, yeah, as long as you have an issue such as this that's causing such problems all throughout the state with landowners, but specifically in those hot spots where certain projects are going through, you're going to continue to see elected officials bring some form of bill or reform to the Texas legislature. Like, you know, Marissa's kind of talked about and David said previously, you know, when our leadership was looking at this over the course of the last several years at this point, we really try to dive into the weeds. And like David said, we had a couple of meetings with some of the Coalition for Critical Infrastructure there in Marissa's office where she now sits, and and tried to talk through some of those and what that could possibly look like. And we went back and forth. And that's where we kind of came up with those three components that you saw in the bill last session. And they're all there to address a problem, and just in our leadership's eyes, a very critical problem that isn't so much project specific, but a problem that you see repetitively across the state in a number of different projects, but a number of different types of projects. And so that's what that bill focused on. And so obviously that's what, our organization was really plugged in with and advocating on, and what we plan to continue advocating on. But I suspect you'll see other bills such as Representative Wiener's. And again, there's always, I'm from East Texas. There's more than one way to skin a cat.
Well, and to that point, landowners have expressed a lack of control over easement terms. And so based on your experience, has or will the legislature consider making mandatory easement terms? For example, an easement limiting the pipeline to one single purpose.
I think there's plenty of indication that points towards some real hope for getting a component like that across the line this go around. Obviously, we can see the value in it from our members' perspectives, but we have repeatedly had good interactions and good feedback from industry groups when we're in negotiations with them, especially on this component of the legislation. It's certainly the case that oftentimes many companies go ahead and give a lot of these protections to those landowners who know to ask for them, and to those who know how to ask for them correctly, making sure to really split hairs on language and just making sure to dot the I's and cross the T's so that you're actually being protected, you're being compensated for any damages, the land resurface or surface restoration is a priority, etc. There's a really long list of what those terms could entail. Certainly, we believe that landowners should have the ability to build upon that standard set if there is a desire to end up passing such a bill with this easement term component established in it. But also, it's really important that those terms, whatever is negotiated with the entity, carries through the process if there still becomes a disagreement or a settlement can't be reached on fair compensation, and say the landowner is proceeding through to special commissioners hearings and beyond.
Well, and that kind of piggybacks on something David said earlier about equity for landowners. And so what about those liability protections and navigating where one landowner is more sophisticated than another? So I either have an attorney or I know exactly what to ask for, but my next door neighbor doesn't. Or going back to Colcourse bill about transparency, where if there was more transparency in the process, you could have public meetings where landowners could discuss what their options are, what all the routes were. Because in the case of the Permian Highway pipeline, they've had to negotiate the direction of that pipeline on a couple of occasions. One, going through or underwater. Two, they ran into a problem with karst features. And so if landowners were able to have a seat at that table initially, wouldn't you be able to identify the landowners who wanted pipelines on their property? Because there's a significant number who do versus those who don't. But then also, not only in terms of landowner equity, but them knowing and understanding their land and what they think is fair. So I think that that's something that is interesting, and I'm curious as to what the legislature is eager to see versus kind of puts their foot down in terms of that transparency for their constituents.
It's anyone's guess what the legislature is eager to see or not see. I certainly haven't been able to crack that code, but we did pass a bill last session effectively, and certainly out of the Senate, and had the votes in the House to adopt the Senate bill that ran out of time, as I mentioned. It did include a fair amount of transparency. And to your point, I think when and included meeting language, and that's really at the heart of what we're trying to get to, is helping these landowners understand what's going on, to raise the minimum standard up to what I would describe as an initiated landowner dealing with a corporate good actor. And there are good fair market type transactions in this eminent domain process, or in the pipeline construction process. And there's a lot of really great examples of landowners that are firmly in control, that want the pipeline, they recognize the economic value of that, but yet are able to manage it through routing through their property, and other easement terms, liability protections, and just that long suite of things that can be done to enhance the whole process. There is a model out there. I think some of the impetus is on organizations like ours to help those landowners come together and compare notes, compare offers, and trade their experiences with one another to help their neighbors. And that's a big part of it. But I think it is fallacy for us to accept entire responsibility, that there needs to be some statutory provisions and protections to that process. So I'll leave it with that and pitch it over to somebody that's better at this than me. Marissa?
Well, kind of on top of that too, there's one thing to be able to know and potentially even kind of predict the legislative interests, but hopefully we can continue a good relationship with the industry groups and the partners that we've began working with last session to really get this bill 99% of the way through last session. And there was a lot of value in that too. They expressed publicly interest and responsibility towards shoring up a eminent domain process that enables a secure process for the takings if necessary, but also just gives a lot of transparency and promotes confidence that this process is being used judiciously and for the right reasons, and only, of course, when necessary, while providing those critical landowner protections that should just be coming automatically. We appreciate the time that went in from the industry side as well, and we'd like to make sure that the groups work both from the landowner groups standpoint, as well as all the time and energy invested on behalf of the industry groups too, comes out to fruition. But we'll see. It's going to be an interesting session.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because on the flip side of there being little oversight on, in particular, pipeline construction in the state of Texas, I'm curious to know what the industry thinks, because they're, to David's point, mentioning bad actors, not all companies in the industry are bad. There's a majority of them who are good, and they do work with landowners, and they properly mitigate what they have come through, and they want to make sure that, you know, when they have left, it looks like nothing ever happened. And so I'm curious, from your conversations with the industry and some of your experience kind of navigating some of the legislative pieces, why the industry wouldn't want more transparency on their end, so they're protected from the folks in their industry who are the bad actors and aren't doing some of the great work that the good actors are doing in oil and gas.
I think one of the challenges that they experience is probably very similar to the ones that we experience as, property owners. And that is not everybody sees things the same way. As David mentioned, some people see the economic benefit, and some folks are, welcome with open arms a pipeline company that's trying to put infrastructure into their place, because perhaps they've been through it before. They know what to expect. They know what they're getting. And so they're ready to negotiate and find an agreement that works for everyone. And whereas others, there's some people who adamantly oppose a pipeline, regardless of what the terms or conditions are. And there's some of those people out there. Similarly, in the all of these industries, but if we're going to pick on the oil and gas industry, each one of those companies, we've been working a coalition of property owners with a coalition of industry, but each one of those businesses operate in their own way, and they have their own way of doing things. And that's, I think, one of the challenges is finding a way to put something that works for everybody down on paper that they're all comfortable with. Because yeah, they all, there's certainly some good actors, but these good actors do it completely different than these other good actors do. And they say, look, what we're doing, we think works, which, maybe so. But to get something that's put down on paper, so that folks are secure and understand what it is that they're sitting down to the table to negotiate is just very difficult. And that's one of the challenges that we, as an industry, we as property owners, we as Texans have to come in and sit down and figure out how to conquer some of those challenges. Because it's, I kind of liken it to buying a car off Facebook Marketplace without seeing any pictures. Who knows what you're going to get? And when you look at the bills that we brought, that was the purpose, is to try to shine light, provide pictures to what that process should look like. Because when you start talking about some of those easement terms, we've had some folks that, were not familiar with the process. And like I said, the worst calls are the ones that call us after the fact. And they say, hey, my property's torn up. It's all, I can't do anything with it. It's not reseeded. My fences are still down, this, that, and the other. What can I do? I was like, well, did you get any of that stuff written down into a contract with those guys? Well, I didn't know I was supposed to. I was under the assumption that, they would put it back the way they found it. But, obviously we have a different interpretation between myself and them of how it looked when they found it. And so that's kind of the goal of the legislation that we've been bringing, is to show them, hey, this is what it should look like. Here's the basic minimums that they need to put it back the way they found it. What does that mean to both parties?
Yeah, and real quick, just I'm sure the folks that are listening are a sophisticated bunch on this process, but really the core components of the bill that we worked on with Senator Kolkhorst and Representative Burns were a meeting component, a minimum easement component, and then a substantiated initial offer component. And really all of that is designed for there to be a fair offer early in the process to a landowner. Because if a landowner has to fight and has to lawyer up and go through a protracted process, they're only arguing about the price. And a common carrier enjoys the indemnity of the state, and their loser pay statutes do not apply here. So the best a landowner will ever do if they go through this process in a protracted way is a fair market value less the cost to defend their estate. And that's just, it's a built-in haircut, and it's not fair at all. And if we can incentivize either through carrot or stick a fair offer up front, all of that goes away. The pipeline is built faster. It's done in a less controversial way, and the landowners are treated like the partners that they should be. And that's been our approach. Not to put words in Kaleb or Marissa's mouths, but certainly from TWA, that's been our philosophy.
Well, and something that Kaleb hit on earlier was, how rapidly Texas is growing and changing. And so we have seen some proposals on how to adapt with that growth, work with folks getting from point A to point B. And so one of the recent proposals that's been in the news as of late is the Texas Central Railway, running from Houston to Dallas, that spans 11 counties and would absorb roughly 3,000 acres of private rural property. So does your organization have a position on this? And is this maybe something that would be also addressed in the next legislative session?
I'm not going to speak to Farm Bureau and Texas Wildlife Association because I know all of our policies differ. But I know that's something that Cattle Raisers does, not specifically that we're anti high-speed rail, right? But that we have concerns over high-speed rail's use of eminent domain. And again, we as an organization we don't try to get project specific, right? And so we'll have folks contact us wanting to get involved in some case in condemnation or something, like, we're sorry, we're talking about the process, the overall process statewide. However, whenever there is some precedent that could be set, occasionally we will get involved to some degree. And the high-speed rail for our organization is one of those, because sure, it's the use of eminent domain like a transmission line is, or like a pipeline is. It is a private for-profit entity, like some of those companies and those other two industries. The difference is the use of that and its impact on the property owner. And so you're opening that up to a whole new industry that is going to be, competing for the use of the private property in this state, to put their for-profit project in. And again, that's really because it is so precedent setting, and the challenges with some of that. As I mentioned, I'm from East Texas. I have family in like Madison County on my wife's side and Polk County on my side. And I've got some family members through my wife's side of the family that train is going to go across. And I know we sat down with Texas Central Railway very early, had multiple meetings with them. And as, an East Texan that lives in that area, I asked, like, well, how do we get implements from one side of the property to the other? We can drive under a power line, we can drive over a pipeline. But in this case, if I've got a couple 100 acres here, I'm raking hay and I have an 8-wheeled rake. How do I get from this side to the other side? And they're like, well, it'll be on pillars. Well, it won't be on pillars all of the time. Some of it's going to be a berm. Well, we'll dig a hole underneath the tracks. And I was like, well, that's going to be what we in East Texas call a pond, because it's going to fill with water. There's no way I can drive a tractor underneath the ground with an 8-wheel rake and it fit under there and it not be full of alligators and snakes and whatever else. And so that's certainly David's laughing because he knows I'm right. But those are just an example of how much different that project is than some of the other private industry projects that use condemnation authority. And because of that precedent it would set for those type of projects in the future, our organization has opposed their use, not the project itself, but their use of eminent domain and condemnation. And I think that kind of goes back to, I believe it was in about 2009, and that constitutional amendment, I forgot, it was somewhere on the Northeast, where you had a case of a hotel trying to condemn property for economic development. And that was something that the people of Texas weighed in on and said, look, that we don't think that is a valid use of eminent domain in this state. And sure, this isn't purely economic development. It kind of hides under the guise of transporting people from one place to another, but it's just the precedent it sets. There's a real slippery slope that our organization has come out in a opposition to.
And more broadly too, just what the high-speed rail issues really highlight, as well as just the lack of clarity that landowners really have given the way the current statute is written. It is completely ambiguous and gives very little certainty or understanding of an entity, plain and simple, having the right of eminent domain within the state of Texas. When you have those fights going on, it's currently being litigated, but landowners are being negotiated with and spoken to, and I think dealt with by that entity and by the company itself. That's really that puts them in a really difficult situation, and we've got to make sure that the legislature fully understands, given the lack of, I guess, more of a black and white picture due to statute affirming or not that company's eminent domain status, the process and just the open-ended complexities of whether or not that the company has eminent domain and then being forced though still to go through the process as if it does, just really speaks to a lot of what the beginning challenges of dealing with these entities end up looking like. Sometimes those can carry through into questions about common carrier, and largely our efforts within Farm Bureau at least have been pretty focused on having the conversations more so about the process than which entities do or do not have the power, and asking serious questions around that. Although that is certainly out there, and we hear that a lot from our members, asking us to maybe one day wade into that fight, but that's not going to be certainly what we are facing for next legislative session, but we'll see.
And I think, Marissa, you hit a very critical point there. Like, this is at least in the eyes of Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, this is a completely separate issue than, the issue surrounding eminent domain as a process in the state of Texas right now, which is what we've been hyper focused on the last couple of legislative sessions. Yes, I see the similarities there and such, but it's a completely different set of issues. And like I said, from our organization standpoint, it's more on the precedent side of it. And then whereas what we've been hyper focused on is the process of eminent domain for private for-profit entities in the state of Texas.
And just so I'm making sure I'm making myself clear too, we have been supportive of some of the high-speed rail bills filed in the past, some, not all, as well as efforts like that of Representative Wiener to provide some routing process for pipelines too.
Well, so speaking of something that has been very prominent this year is this pandemic. And two of the things I think are interesting that the pandemic elevated are, one, that the economy is heavily reliant on oil and gas, not just in Texas, but in the whole country. And so I'm wondering if, in particular with this industry, does that encourage or discourage potential negotiations in terms of eminent domain reforms? And the other is the strain of broadband needing to reach the masses in a real way, in particular to rural areas, because of the nature of how we're conducting business, kids are going to school, and we are hopeful that we heard there might be a vaccination, but what does that mean in terms of broadband increasing, reach to those rural areas?
Well, I know, I think it was, Jessica, don't get me to line, but I believe it was last session. There was a bill. I remember having meetings in Senator Robert Nichols' office. He may have been the author. I don't recall. Jeremy Fox in our office actually staffed that issue for us. But it was talking about some of the broadband issues in rural Texas. And yes, that's been an issue that's been brought up repeatedly as of late. I know the Texas Tribune has a rural symposium going on right now, and I was watching that at lunch, and Representative James White, who is my state rep back home where I'm from, lives about 20 miles from my parents. He kept cutting out in the middle of the rural symposium because I guess he doesn't have adequate broadband or Wi-Fi to do. And it was odd that one of the topics that he brought up and discussed was the need for broadband in rural Texas. And I know one of the bills that we were very active on and engaged and supportive of last time was how the co-ops, the electric co-ops in the state, were able to put that in, and while retaining protections for property owners. Again, that was our critical mission in those negotiations. Like, look, we recognize the need here, just like in power line, the need for power line transmission lines, and just like the need for pipelines, we understand the need here. Let's do this in a way that takes everybody into consideration. In our opinion, do it the right way, but certainly protect the property rights of those individuals where that infrastructure is going across. And we've done this before in Texas history. We've done this in other segments of the industry, and I think that bill is a good example of how we've worked together to do that, even in recent history.
Well, something looking forward is next year is a redistricting year. And so I wanted to get each of your thoughts on how you see redistricting affecting rural areas and their representation, and if you think it will also play a role in affecting eminent domain reforms.
I'll take a quick early stab at that. I think the expectation is for the redistricting discussion to come in after the regular session when census data is available. So I'm hopeful that we can make some progress and wrap up the eminent domain discussion in the regular session. Certainly redistricting colors, all considerations in the legislature, whether it's the regular or special session. I think what is interesting and worth focusing on is just the raw demographics of our state, how urbanized we are. About 15% of our state populations are considered rural. Obviously there's a lot of gray area in places like where Kaleb is sitting right now. Is that urban? Is that rural? It's kind of one foot in both camps, but I won't offer any prognostications on how the redistricting process will go, but it's important that rural Texans are not disenfranchised. And furthermore, I think it accentuates the need for organizations like TRED and cattle raisers and Farm Bureau and TWA and others to continue focusing our message in the urban and suburban markets and areas of our state's population, because while they may not be landowners, while they may not be hunters, they may not be farmers or ranchers, they are enjoying the societal benefits from all that open space that's stewarded by private landowners. Wildlife habitat, aquifer recharge, carbon sequestration, air filtration, food, fiber, on and on and on. And that benefit that such a small cadre of landowners, less than 1% of our population, provides to all Texans is really important and shouldn't be missed. And I think that's a drum that we all need to be beating, where it won't matter what the district maps are, because clean water and breathable air and coveys of bobwhite quail and all that, there's no party lines there. So it's interesting in this discussion. It's really truly nonpartisan. There are opponents to, or maybe not maybe opponents is too strong a word. Maybe it's not. I don't know, but there are differences of opinion on this issue across the entire political spectrum and ideological spectrum in our state legislature, from very progressive liberal folks like Representative Zwiener on some issues, to very traditionally conservative members of the legislature like Senator Kolkhorst, but yet they are recognizing that they're in the same sandbox when it comes to property rights and rural issues. So I don't know, in some ways it gives me more optimism than pessimism.
Yeah, I would certainly expand on that, because we are an ecosystem, and we are all relying upon each other, and we all have to thrive, and to put someone in a position where they're destined to fail, will all fail at the end. But even more so, and these are Kaleb numbers, they did not come from anywhere but my simple math. But at one point in time, a couple years ago, I was looking at the makeup of the Senate districts, and I believe 71% of the Texas Senate districts represent at least a portion of the 5 most populated counties in the state of Texas. So by those metrics, it looks incredibly urban makeup of the legislature as it sits. And I believe it's like 46% or something of the House. And so it has that appearance, but we're still working on a lot of these issues that have been traditionally perceived as rural. But one thing that we have to remember is that, to David's point, all people have to eat and be clothed and be sheltered. They need they need all of these things that agricultural and rural lands provide, just like they need, some of the things that the oil and gas industry or the transmission lines provide. And so I'm going to put that out there, and then also say that when you look in those urban areas that are seeing the majority of our growth, a lot of times you have to remember that there's a lot of property owners in those areas also. And if they aren't property owners, they're leasing or renting property in some form or fashion, in the form of a condo or an apartment or a house. And so all of those issues affect them just the same as it does folks that live in rural Texas. And so that's a real critical point. And you have to recognize that a lot of that infrastructure is being brought in is going, if not in, very close to a lot of those urban centers. And so there's a lot of challenges there for people also. And so I'm like David. I don't know that I'm going to sit here. I don't know if we should be optimistic. I certainly don't think that we should be pessimistic when we look at that shift of the potential shift of the makeup of our bicameral system after redistricting. And sorry, Marissa, I might have cut you off.
No, it's okay. If you think about it too, just from the sheer kind of perspective of understanding that more and more of the rural area could be represented by fewer and fewer legislators in the future, while that's not necessarily something that we'd hope and want to look forward to, there could be some light to that gets shed on the eminent domain process. There are many senators that we get to work with and whose offices are exposed to a big variety of development issues, of entities that are using eminent domain, and of experiences by landowners and how they're being treated and how they feel about that process. If that ends up being the case for some of our House members that get to understand, I guess, an expanded perspective from those who are facing these challenges, that could potentially really help improve our situation in terms of making some real progress on eminent domain reform in the future. So I could see it. I mean, I can definitely see the optimistic perspective prevailing. And just, when it comes to COVID and potential hurdles that's placed before us when it comes to this immediate next coming session, kind of really just speaks to all the more reason why we need to get it done and get it taken care of, because we have bigger, more like very real problems that we need to be focusing up on, whether it's broadband, healthcare, you name it. These should be minor things, and we don't need to continue to make, a mountain out of these molehills when it comes to how we're trying to improve the process and also keep it the case that enables infrastructure development just without landowners being able to be taken advantage of.
Well, we have been very informative this evening, because I have just a couple of questions from the audience tonight. So I'll go ahead and kick that off and remind everyone that if you do have a question that I haven't seen, you can use the Q&A box that is on your right-hand side. So one I will start with is, what about process for landowners who go through condemnation hearings when the special commissioner's determination is appealed? Some current condemnation appeals will take 5 to 7 years to get through the courts. Until that time, the landowner isn't able to access the condemnation award, yet the project goes on.
Anybody?
Not all at once.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very valid and very accurate, and sometimes all too oftenly occurring example of when this process does end up in the district courts. And we get a lot of phone calls, and you have to remember, I'll say the vast majority of our membership is of Texas Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association is in that 0 to 50 head range, meaning that a lot of small operators who are doing this obviously part-time, and I'll use my parents as an example. They're a 2-bull operation. They got a handful of cows, 2 bulls, cut enough hay to feed those animals throughout the winter. And there's a lot of folks exactly like them, and folks that may not have that many cattle. And when you look at them, a lot of them are breaking even, maybe making a little bit of money doing that. When you have a pipeline project come through and interrupt an entire year's worth of hay crop, and you have to feed those animals that winter on your dime, and that process is held up in the district courts, that becomes all of a sudden a detriment to the well-being of your family, because you may not have the funds to do that. And so you're selling cattle. And right now during COVID, I know the oil and gas industry has been hit by it pretty hard, as has property owners, specifically ag producers, cattle producers. Our markets are not very good at all right now. And so hitting some of those people in that way, how do they come back from that? And then you think, you have grass and grazing that's interrupted because of that. When fences are down and you're not able to graze that paddock or that pasture for an extended period of time, you have to severely change your operations, which you may not have planned and most likely did not plan for. And then all of a sudden you take a program that, especially under the economic strains that we're experiencing today, we're just hoping to break even. And that's the final nail in the coffin that really determines whether you can continue operating or not. And that's why, unfortunately, there's a trend right now where you see a lot of those smaller operations just saying, look, we're selling out and we're done. We'll sell this, to somebody else who might end up in a development, and where you lose some of those benefits that David talked about earlier with carbon sequestration and all of these other type things, groundwater. And so how do you delay that for 5-10 years for those people? Because that may be too much to set them back. And I think that's where the legislation that our three organizations and others have really been advocating for, its main mission and goal is to get these projects going quicker. It's to lessen the burden on those property owners, so that we don't have to sit there and go through a commissioner's court hearing, much less a district court hearing. The thought is, if you have these protections put in place, people know that, hey, they're going to put the land back the way they found it. They've been to a public meeting. They understand the process. They know what's to come. They know they can't sit there with the shotgun when the surveyors come by and threaten to shoot them, because they got that information at a public meeting perhaps, and they know whenever they got an offer, what that offer was based upon, and so that they can assess that appropriately. We, as David and Marissa has mentioned previously, we think that speeds up the process and lets people get back to their everyday lives. Because whether you're a small-time person that doesn't do it full-time, or someone that does it and your livelihood depends on this, you want this to be as least invasive as possible. And I think the only way to do that is to make sure that this is a quick and easy process when it comes through. And so to that person's point, that's a severe issue that a lot of the people that call our offices experience. And so the goal of the legislation that we've been advocating for, in our opinion, would help prevent so many of those cases going to district court.
Well, and so a follow-up question to that is, how much time and money do you think would be saved if there was a process in place instead of oil and gas companies and landowners negotiating in the courts?
I don't know a single landowner that is looking forward to going to court, because it does cost a lot of money. I don't know what that dollar amount is. Maybe Marissa or David has a better estimate.
Yeah, it'd be impossible to put a finger on an actual dollar amount, but just suffice it to say that most attorneys that represent landowners are compensated as a contingency based on improvement to the final offer from the condemnor. And so that is fair market value money that's not landing in the hands of the landowner. So for anybody to posit that landowners want to be in extended litigation or trying to make a payday at the courthouse, down on the local level, on the ground, they're dealing with those interrupted hay meadows and paying real money out of their pocket to attorneys. So in our mind, everything that we can do to make the process more expeditious is worth pursuing.
And so another question is there any progress in having the Railroad Commission in be more than just a rubber stamp in determining what is public use in the case of pipelines?
That's not something I can speak to definitively. Our focus has obviously been on this process component. Kaleb or Marissa may be able to speak to the Helvinka case and precedent that set on eminent domain standing for private entities. Certainly that's a problem. But from my observation, the Railroad Commission is reticent to get into that business, and it's been left to the courts to make those decisions.
There's been, and as far as what we've been paying attention to, and I'd like to think that we've been paying attention to the full enchilada, there's been no progress on that issue that he mentioned in terms of rubber stamping companies that just come in. I mean, I guess it was after let me try and reference my notes really fast to make sure I'm quoting accurately, but I guess it was the 2013 legislative session, which the common carrier bills really emerged after a big Texas Supreme Court case. That was basically the last session that we've really touched the common carrier, any common carrier legislation. That issue ended up being one that could have gone extremely well for landowners, but due to several different factors and much of the legislation that ended up surfacing was really making sure that the entities were being taken care of and protected in order to maintain their common carrier status and not have that as easily, I guess, up for question through the court system. But quite frankly, there were a few more regulatory requirements put into place. I'm not going to go into the details on those because that'll probably produce all kinds of discussion as to whether those were sufficient or not, which that might be for another time because I think that is actually a valuable conversation. But at the same time, we haven't seen, unless there's something that y'all remember, Kaleb or David, as far as any legislation addressing that.
Well, there's another one do you have any suggestions as to how to get more public awareness and understanding of this issue? I mean, and I would answer that saying that's what Tread Talks is about. And what Kaleb mentioned earlier with the Texas Tribune, it's the future of rural Texas. It's every day this week at noon, but you can also watch it at any time, and it is free for consumption, so you can visit their website. But I think really it's a matter of looking, with your friends and neighbors around you to identify what they're dealing with issue-wise, what's happening with your Rotary, what's happening in the paper, and just kind of being a little bit more plugged in so you can understand a little bit more about it. As I've been with the organization a year, I have barely begun to chip away at this particular issue among all the other issues that rural landowners face, and really any Texan faces. So I guess just, finding ways in which you can make yourself more aware. But as a reminder, I included my contact information in the chat. So you can always reach out to me, and I'm happy to direct you to our fellow panelists here and, direct you in the right place for any information that you're looking for. With that, I don't think there's some comments that I'm happy to share with the panel later, but I don't think that there's any other questions. So with that, I thank you all for your time this evening. Thank you to all of the participants who joined us. And we're grateful for having you all as our panel and discussing such a hot button issue. As I mentioned earlier, this Tread Talk has been recorded, so you can reference it later on, and you can also find it on our Facebook page. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, Jessica Karlsruher, at treadcoalition.org. And again, thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great week.
Jessica, thanks for including us. Appreciate you hosting this.
Yeah, very much appreciate you and your organization and for having us on this evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you all. And hopefully next time it'll be in person. We'll see.
Fingers
Have
crossed.
a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice.